Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
Well, Nathan, we need to talk about a tendency that we have today where we will identify a significant problem and blow it out of proportion. Or just take it way too far. Let me start with a specific example. An article by Ted Gioia crossed my radar. It was sent to me. I like Ted Gioia. Been reading him for years. For those of you who don't know, he is, well, one way he's a jazz critic. He's a music critic, but he trained at, he did his, I think he studied at Stanford. Very sharp guy, really good writer, very articulate on the arts and the value of the arts. But he had a recent piece come out making a number of arguments that I think will sound very familiar to our listeners. Basically, he was arguing in this article that we are in a post-entertainment age. We're hearing post, that just continues to be very popular, post-entertainment. I've heard we're in a post-literate age before as well. But yeah, so a post-entertainment age. And what he means by that is, and he pulls some alarming numbers, but basically people are not really inclined to sit through an entire television show anymore, much less a movie. According to these numbers, people really what they want are quick, highly amusing videos, TikTok style, reels, that sort of thing. And so and basically the people who make these things make them as maximally addicting as possible. Again, none of this is new. We've been, I think the first two books that were really massively popular to broach this topic were The Shallows by Nicholas Carr and then Alone Together by Sherry Turkle. We've referenced those numerous times on the show. But things have escalated since then. But he talked about, basically what happens in the brain, the dopamine rush that we get addicted to. But then there's the law of diminishing returns that happens. So you want these quick, dopamine fixes, but it begins to give you less and less of what you want. And so we begin to behave more and more like addicts. And then he makes some observations about walking through public places like an airport and seeing the hollow-eyed stare of addicts with their phones in their hands. And I just don't buy all of it, Nathan. I agree, of course, that attention spans are continuously challenged. I agree that deep focus is a big issue. I agree that so much of what we have out there is so incredibly dangerously amusing. I think often of David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest, where you have a movie. What part of the plot in that movie involves the film is called Infinite Jest, and it's a lethally entertaining piece of. It's a movie that if you watch it basically you'll die because you lose all incentive to take care of yourself and all of this, and it's kind of a funny device. So I think of that too. But nevertheless, how does this there's a whole genre, and it's been around for a long time, Nathan, of people I have on my bookshelves, for instance, books that were written in the 1990s and 80s about the death of literacy, and they're always written by older, highly educated people lamenting about how nobody will read Homer anymore, nobody will read Shakespeare anymore because nobody wants to devote the time to serious art because serious art challenges you. And Ted Gioia's piece is very much in that whole, and it's usually people who are getting older who write these kinds of things. And again, it's a form of weird self-indulgence because are we struggling mightily with addiction in our culture? Absolutely. We have been for a long time. Are we going to reach a time where people are no longer going to read Shakespeare or Homer or Virginia Woolf? I just don't think so. A lot of these kids are going to grow up. So in other words, Nathan, to what we said earlier, we're taking what is a very legitimate and real problem and catastrophizing and now saying we're going to come to a time where there's, there'll be no deep focus, no attention spans anymore. Nobody will think through. Nobody will want serious and demanding art, much less a full episode of a movie or an entire, of a show or an entire movie. I just don't buy it. Am I wrong? Am I being naive?
I think you might be a little bit optimistic on this one. However, this is exactly the core of what we want to talk about here, is that, and this is where you and I specifically frequently get ourselves in trouble, is because we often say, yeah, it's not really as bad as everybody's making it sound. Now, that's not because we're overly optimistic. It's because, think about what Gioia is doing there is, something is deeply wrong with the world, and I've put my finger on what the problem is. So there's almost some types of problem identification are almost like a quasi-messiahism of like, everybody can tell that something's wrong, and I've figured out what the issue is. And I think you and I would come along and be like, yeah, no, it's more complicated than that. There's a whole lot more going on. But then the challenge is that either A, you're naive, or B, you're not an expert. And that's where these things become divisive. So let me just throw my version of this. And so I read the statistic the other day. In the last 2 years, 11% of children have been diagnosed with ADHD. Last 2 years, 11% of U.S. children have been diagnosed with ADHD, and boys at twice the rate than girls. Okay. How do you say these two things? I think ADHD is a real thing. And I also don't think that 1 out of every 9 children has diagnosable ADHD. There's a tension in saying that phrase, because people are like, well, you don't understand how bad the problem is, or you're not an expert, or who are you to say? So same thing with you and attention span and all this. How do you say, hey, there's a problem here, and it is not this catastrophic collapse of all the stable societies that we've ever known beforehand due to this one issue? So how do you take a problem and see that it is not the defining problem of our generation? And how do we not reward people with messianic expectations for their ability to scare us all into thinking that life as we know it is collapsing around us at the same time? That seems to me to be a challenge of our time. This started all the way back in COVID. Yeah. This was a COVID question, Cameron. How do you know how seriously to take the problem?
Yep. Right. Well, let me give you, in answer to that, I want to give you two arguments. One's philosophical in nature and one's practical. And then I want to see what you think of these. Number one, and this is something I've been developing a little bit lately and playing around with. We'll see I'm curious about what you think of it. So we talk, human beings are fallen. So we are Christians. We both believe that. So we challenge often the myth of what I would call the myth of progress, the notion that we're gradually getting better. And I have vigorously challenged that in the past. I've said, no, we're not getting better. We're not morally superior these days. Now we see reforms. No, hold on. We see moral reforms and things like that. Yes. We see technological advances. Yes. But we're not growing. We're not evolving morally. So we don't evolve morally. Human nature, I would argue, is relatively stable. But if we don't evolve, we also don't devolve. Now, I do think we can get to place. Now, you have inherent in you. You can sink to serious lows. That's intrinsic to human nature, because you can violate your nature. That's one way to say it. One very basic way to say it is you can violate your nature. You're never going to find a tiger or a cheetah or a baboon that violates its nature. Those creatures are fiercely consistent. They are themselves 100%. They don't need any seminars or books on it. They know what to do. Human beings, we violate our nature all the time. Self-help books, all of it, discovering your inner child. But that's not the same thing as devolving. So a lot of these kinds of arguments that look at, dwindling attention spans and all of that, they're proceeding as though we are devolving in some significant way, and we're going to usher in a new idiocracy. That was the title of a comedy that came out. I think it was the late 90s. And I don't think that happens. Now, I do think you have times of civilizational decay. So I do think you can have a culture that goes into. That's the important distinction. That can happen. You can have an institution, or you can have a culture that decays. That's not the same thing as human nature devolving. Human nature is relatively stable. And so for that reason, I don't think you ever reach an age where you won't have people, they might be outliers, but you won't have people who are thinking seriously and who love demanding works of art, for instance, and who are able to, give deep focus to things and who are fiercely disciplined. You're just not going to have, that's just a perennial feature of human existence. There are dark features of human existence, but there are also good features of human existence, and they don't go away. The other argument is just that there's growing awareness of this, Nathan. This is the practical argument. There's growing awareness of how deleterious the effects are of social media, TikTok, and things like this. And people are taking aims against it, and people are actually taking practical steps now. So I think those two things are where I would kind of put my flag in the ground for a second.
Okay, so I think it's very important that you differentiated between human nature and cultural stability and decline. Yeah, because history bears that out, that there are massive cycles and patterns but then it does correlate to behavior too. You look at some of the bleaker parts of the past, even in the Western world, England, and some of the times before some of the great revivals and awakenings and stuff. There's some pretty wild times in the past. I think for the tone of this podcast, often history becomes one of the not limiting, but like a moderating factor. When you hear people say the sky is falling, we're like, compared to what? So the degree to which history plays into our mindsets of what's normal is important here. Now, let me make a case that perhaps a difference now is that technology does allow us to amplify cultural shift so fast that it does seem to be more disorienting to an older generation. Somebody just asked me this. He's like, well, I guess everybody's always been worried about the next generation and about the kids, right? Kids these days. What seems to me to be new is, okay, Cameron, how many people do you know? Maybe a gentleman in their late 70s who now has a trans grandchild. And this just, doesn't even make sense. Like it's a category of existence, and it's that didn't even occur in their mind until recently. So all of a sudden you do seemingly have new thing, quote air quotes here, new things under the sun becoming culturally mainstream at a sense that, and then the communication channels are different. How people are communicating, how people are forming communities or online groups, or they're forming their identities does seem to be changing so fast that it genuinely is disorienting for people who are trying to keep up with some of the speed of the change, I guess. So in the midst of that, though, this brings us back to how do we, as Christians, sit in the middle of some of these things and say, yes, that is an issue. And as Christians, we have the tools to deal with it and make sense of it and to be helpful to everybody involved. And there's almost a sense in which the lifeguard has to stay on the lifeguard stand and watch everybody in the pool, because when the lifeguard jumps into the pool, nobody can help anybody else at that point. And so it seems to me like there's a role here for Christian thought and for the church to not jump off the deep end every single time that we see a statistic or hear a news story or something, because there's a sense in which you're just flinging yourself into the same perspective that everybody else has, which is one of the skies falling, terror, woe is us, it's all going to hell in a handbasket. And so to be able to say, yes, this is a real issue, this is something that needs attention and concern, but it isn't, it feels insensitive to say to somebody like, yeah, but you're making a bigger deal out of it than it actually is. We're running into this all the time in parenting. This kid does this to this kid and they have a meltdown. And you say, hey, look, the wrong thing happened here, but your response was totally disproportionate to the size of the actual problem here. I can see that when I'm talking to a 4-year-old, but I feel like that's a conversation that I'm needing to have more often. And I don't know how to gently do that with 40-year-olds. Does that make, or 70-year-olds, pick your number. I don't that's the mud puddle I've been wallowing in.
Social acceleration is a very real feature of our age. And yeah, it is. So stuff does move very fast, and it feels that way because of technology. But I'm still genuinely hesitant to say that what we're dealing with today is so incredibly unprecedented and new. It seems to me that the tendency to say that is a symptom of our age. We tend to we really look at what's going on around us and we think, yeah, but if I've heard people say this all the time, but what we're dealing with, this really is unique. This really is different. We'll see if we ever come back from this. And statements like that. And I guess what strikes me about that is that assumes a level of kind of comprehensive knowledge about where we're at and our age that I believe to be naive. Because that would make sense that we would assume. Yeah.
I don't know. Because there are some features that we now have tendencies to amplify. So, I mean, let's think of this, for example. Let's back up 70 years. 60. Let's go 1960. So let's think about the desire for most of a species to not want to reproduce. And
mm-hmm.
So if you're looking at a culture where the vast majority of young people is like, no, I don't think I ever want to have kids or have a family. Some people are going to look at that and say, even from a biological perspective, this is a new feature. Or the idea that I would want to have totally digitally curated life to not.
Yeah.
So individuals will always pursue this, but when you when the culture reaches a certain percentage of individuals, then that's a different. It's a unique animal.
All right.
It might be a unique manifestation of something that's always been there, but it is a unique manifestation of that thing.
No, but we're describing trends that are largely in the West right now. I mean, globally, that's not necessarily the case, that everybody thinks we don't want to reproduce anymore. But I do think, I mean, that's why, broadly speaking, well, two things might be happening here. I think here's where I am in agreement. We are seeing the West in sharp cultural decline. There's no other way to read the signs of what, the kind of trends that you just pointed out, Nathan. But that doesn't mean that the whole world is in sharp decline. Now, it makes sense. We often, let me give you an example here that makes a lot of sense. There's at the end of his life, H.G. Wells, great science fiction writer, War of the Worlds, The Time Machine. He wrote numerous books. He was a committed utopian for most of his career, and he really believed that we could perfect the human race. And at the end of his life, he wrote a book called The Man at the End of His Tether. And he was, at that point himself, in sharp physical decline. And he went from, and it was a stark departure from his other writings. It was fiercely pessimistic. And in that book, he basically just says that some, major event will happen where we basically lose the script, so to speak, and we're just going to hurtle toward oblivion and ultimate extinction. And people asked, what happened to H.G. Wells that so affected his mindset? Why did he think like this? Well, he was writing this book as he was dying. And so some of his recent biographers point out there's, you can't explain it all away in terms of this, but clearly his own mortality was affecting his worldview. And clearly that happens to a lot of us. And clearly we look at the world around us and we look at our culture, and that affects so it's no accident that a lot of people are looking at the decline of the West and thinking, well, the world is absolutely just coming apart at the seams, but not the entire world is not necessarily.
Okay. So let me look for a middle solution here. There's this picture of me when I was a kid. We were somewhere at a lake or something as a family, and there was an old post out into the lake from a previous pier or dock or something, and the tops of the post were like a quarter of an inch below the water level of the lake. And so I was walking on the tops of the post out into this lake, and it looked like I was walking on the water because the post was, just barely under the surface. But if you're on the shore, it looked like I was walking across the surface of the water, but I was standing on posts that were under the water. And the only reason I remember this is because my aunt took a picture of it. It's kind of funny looking. So the thing for me that I can say two things are true is like, yes, there is cultural decay. Here are real problems. On the other hand, there are problems and categories that I'm not standing on the post that's decaying. I'm standing on something else. And so, I mean, you get this imagery from the Psalms, like he, took me out of the miry pit and set my feet on a rock. So I think I can see things crumbling around me, but I'm not standing on any of the things that are crumbling. Like, that's not my foundation in those categories. So I can see a whole lot of things going wrong with the world and say those are bad, but I don't sense them as an existential threat to genuine goodness, beauty, truth, and love, because I don't think genuine beauty, truth, and love are rooted in the attention span of 12-year-olds. Does that make sense? So like, yeah, that's not good. I get that. But on the other hand, the foundation, I mean, but even that's for our culture, well, you know what? The church has existed before all of the modern nations of the world. So if you're in cultural decline, is that bad? Yes, that's no fun, no good. On the other hand, does that mean that the church gets destroyed? Not necessarily. And so I guess for me, it's this, what's the foundation of, where do you, I mean, I guess I'm asking it as a question, but it's a rhetorical question in the sense that from a Christian point of view, this whole, like, I think that's why we sing the hymns, on Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. This idea of the foundation of Christ being the cornerstone, that when I look at the sort of abundant categories of how much scripture speaks to how do you live in the middle of a chaotic culture, it seems to me that the tools are obviously there in order to do that well. So I can, in some ways, live in this sweet spot where two things can be true at the same time. I say, yep, that's bad, and Christ is still on his throne. And so I have a position of stability to critique things from without losing sleep over whether or not everything's just going to fly apart in some sense. And, I have to stay up all night biting my nails because I don't know what happens next. So I'm looking for a way in which I can say, this is a problem. This is a genuinely new problem. This is an area of concern. And it's probably not as bad existentially as we often think that it is, because our feet are securely planted on something else. So that's my attempt to run down the middle of this situation, is to say, let's recognize that the things that we see that are crumbling are not the things on which we've firmly planted our feet. Does that make sense?
Well, yes, I'm increasingly aware of the fact that if you are a Christian, you really are part of it. Your mindset is going to be entirely different from that of the world. And the way you look at what seems to be practical, the way you look at just the very nature of human life itself. And I mean, because it used to be the case, that there was general consensus among many people that God would bring the world to an end, or that he would see it through and conclude it. Now, by and large, we think human beings will do it, and maybe at an accelerated rate. And that says a whole lot about what we think, not only of God and his, but it says a lot about what we think about ourselves as well. Even if we think, we're the ones who are going to end the world, that might sound like we have a low view of human beings, but of course it's not. It means we think we're the ones in charge and we are the ones in control. A good deal of anxiety vanishes if you really internalize the fact that we are not the ones who are in ultimate control. We're not really in charge completely. We play a decisive role in the maintenance of this planet and, the governing structures of the world, but that's because the Lord has ordained it so. That does not mean and we have a lot of really amazing tools at our disposal, more so than before. We have really advanced, strategies of measuring what's going on and all that. That does not mean, just because we have all these great prognostic tools that can, say, measure brain activity during, when somebody's watching a reel, That doesn't mean that we have a complete understanding of the spiritual condition of where we're at right now. It does not mean that we understand where this is all going. It doesn't mean we know definitively when this is all going to end. We don't. So I think we often get carried away by some of our technological sophistication, and we just tend to think, once again, that we're the ones in charge and we're the ones in control.
You know, there's a word for
once we
this.
let go of that and recognize the falsity of that. Yeah.
when you're gazing into a puddle, fascinated by the beauty of yourself and your own creation and your own possibility. I think there's a word for that, Cameron. What is that? What's the phrase I'm looking for here? Narcissism.
Narcissism.
So is not the antidote to some of this worship? I mean, is worship not the opposite of narcissism and this like continual navel gazing of it's like humanity is so badly messed up right now because humanity is so awesome. Like that's what the Gioia,
mm-hmm.
And it's not Gioia, like everybody's doing this of like, oh, look how we're destroying ourselves because of AI, or like, okay, that's a phenomenal invention. I mean, to think about building a computer system,
right?
Like that, like it's we get.
But look what we do
giddy.
with that. We get
all giddy about like
with the AI units.
Look how awesome we are. We're destroying ourselves. Like we're focused on ourselves for both the brilliance of the weapon that we think we're using to destroy ourselves. Like it's the most human anthropocentric enterprise ever. When we get into some of these vortices of despair.
It's true. And I mean, again, I don't think we have we brought this conversation to a decisive conclusion? Well, absolutely not.
Negative.
I think my hope in this discussion, at least, would be as you know, as you listen in, that we would maybe think about tempering some of our prognostications when we see these reports, because this, especially in my experience, a lot among theologically conservative people, articles like this get passed around, and there's an inherently self-congratulatory aspect to it sometimes, where yes, this is look at this sharp decline in the culture, look at these attention spans dwindling, and there's a kind of patting ourselves on the back aspect to it where we look down on everyone. I really don't like that line of walking through an airport, seeing the hollowed-eyed eyes, hollowed-eyed look of addicts. And well, I mean, how do you know that? I mean, I think we want to just guard against catastrophizing here. We want to there's a balance there. We take the problem seriously, but don't blow them too much out of proportion, and don't think that we have everybody put into a neat little box. I think this is something I have to really guard against in myself as well. And it takes real effort and real discipline, but it's important that we continue seeing persons as persons and recognize, I think, again, I would submit to you, human nature is relatively stable. Yeah, we're capable of sinking to lows. That's inherent in our nature. We're also capable of doing some amazing things, but we don't devolve. A culture can devolve, but not a person. And I think that's worth bearing in mind.
So part of closing. So we don't devolve, but we can become highly distracted. I think that's the feature that seems new, is our capacity to distract ourselves, but that actually isn't new. And focusing, there's a way that I want to pull this together here, Cameron, to take what you just said, which I think is so important, and say, as the people of God, let us not become so distracted by the fixation on the de-evolution of human nature that we miss out on who's actually running the world, who actually deserves our worship, where goodness, truth, and beauty actually reside, what the power of the resurrected Christ and the Holy Spirit mean for living well in the midst of chaos, of how to engage redemptively in a broken world. The reason I'm a Christian is not because not because I don't think there's anything wrong with the world. It's because I think there's plenty wrong with myself and the world that I'm a Christian, and Christianity gives us the tools and the resources and the description of reality that allows us to engage it well. So at the point at which we stop doing that and we become distracted by the chicken little skies falling narrative, there's a sense in which we're jumping off the lifeguard stand into the pool of chaos with everybody else and screaming, losing our minds at what's going on. So this is a call not to say, oh, we don't have to worry about the problems out there. No, it's fine. Point that out, discuss them, keep an eye on the changing culture, but don't do it to the exclusion of reminding where your stability and security and steadfastness really comes from in your life. Because when we can learn to grow in that, then suddenly we become useful and provide a counter narrative on a possible other way to live that we can invite people into. So I want to come out of this with an encouraging note that is radically, as always, pro Christ and his church, because I think we do actually have what's necessary to live well in these times. Thanks be to God. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.